In this video, we're going to look at how to handle validation exceptions in Spring Boot. In the previous video, we looked at how validation exceptions could be generated when the validation annotations detect that there has been some invalid data values. In the previous video, we looked at how to validate data using the validation annotations in bean validation and also at the built-in validation that can occur. And this will generate two types of exceptions. When we're using the bean validation, we'll get method argument not valid exception. And in the other types of validation, we'll get constraint violation exception. And we need to deal with both of these exceptions. If we look in the server log, these exceptions will result in the output of these horribly long and almost unreadable messages that report the errors. I've copied the output from one such error, pasted it into Notepad, and so that we could see the whole thing, I've introduced a few new lines. And I would invite you to make any sense of that. It's certainly not something that the user would see because it's in the server log, and as we saw in the previous video, all the user gets to see is a status 400 error report, which is not in the slightest bit meaningful. Now, these messages that are in here are all generated automatically, and the messages are not terribly helpful. We could, on the annotations, introduce an attribute called message and put in a more meaningful error message on each of those annotations, so that if the annotation detects a data violation, that message will be generated. And these messages are used in the report. As you can see here, ID must be greater than 0. But even so, that's still not a lot better, is it? Because you still get this horrible message, and that's still in the server log. So a much better way of dealing with this is to write an exception handler method in the controller. And here is one such method. The method name is whatever you want to make it. It's not really terribly important in that respect, but of course it should be readable. It's this annotation here, at exception handler, that makes this method a nominated exception handler, and it will be invoked whenever there is a method argument not valid exception. We're also setting the response status to be the bad request, which is the 400 status. This method is going to return a map where it has a string for both the key and the value. We can return from this whatever we want, and that, of course, will be converted into a JSON string and then used at the client end. So what I'm doing in this method is to generate a new hash map, and then we'll get the binding result from the exception. Here it is. That's the exception that we're processing. We'll get the binding result, and then we'll get all errors. And for each of those errors, we're going to put into the hash map the field name and the error message that is generated here. In other words, what we're going to do is to return a map of all the errors containing as a key the field name and as the value the error message. And when we do that and the bean validation detects an error, the generated exception will be sent to this method. The map of errors will be returned to the client, and we get to see this. Now that is so much better than the other exception handling messages. Not only that, these messages now will be sent to the client instead of just being logged in the server log. So that's much better. We can do a similar thing with constraint violation exceptions. Again, we have an exception handler that is nominated for the constraint violation exception. We're still setting the response status to be the bad request. And in this example, we're returning a response entity containing a string. And how we are processing the exception is to get the constraint violations. In this case, we're streaming them, mapping those violations to a string by getting the message template from that violation, and then collecting all those strings into one string where the various strings are separated by semicolon and space. So if there are multiple violations, they will all be collected into one string, separated by the semicolon space, and then we're taking that string, which has been stored here, and adding it to this literal value and returning a response entity whose body is validation error, :space, and then that list of validations. And the result of that will look something like this. Again, we're getting meaningful messages because those messages come from the message attribute on each of the annotations, and the user gets to see something that is helpful. There is a slight problem with this approach, and that is that we would have to have one of these handler methods in each of the controllers that performs validation, and therefore we're likely to be duplicating code. There are various solutions to that, one of which would be to write a global controller advice that will handle all exceptions, and this is some background reading that I recommend that you do. Now that we've got some validation handlers, we can test for errors. And here is one such example where we are posting a request to create a book that has got invalid book details, and we expect some error messages. So here's our bad book DTO, which has got every single field invalid. And then we're using the mock MVC that we've spoken about in a previous video to perform a post request to book/create, whose content is this bad book DTO, and we're identifying the content type as JSON string, and then we're saying we're going to expect a status which is bad request, and then we're checking using the JSON path method to verify the error messages that we get. And this then becomes a very neat way of testing the validation error handling that we get in our applications. As I mentioned a moment ago, there is some background reading that you can do. At these websites, you can take a look at how to externalize error messages and also how to write a controller advice. And then generally, how to handle exceptions in Spring Boot. There are some suggested websites there.